10 facts about Johnny Cash. When Johnny was 12, he lost his older brother Jack due to a vicious saw accident that nearly cut his brother in half. Before he was the Man in Black, he was the Man in Blue, serving in the U.S. Air Force during the Cold War. Due to his unique natural voice, his own vocal coach recommended he did not try vocal lessons. Johnny was a registered ordained minister. Johnny was arrested 7 times in his life, and one of those times was for picking flowers on private property. Despite Bring a Fire being one of Johnny's biggest songs of all time, he did not write it. The scar on Johnny's face came about when he was serving in the Cold War and had to have a procedure done to remove his cyst. Johnny and his wife June Carter appeared in a 1976 episode of Little House on the Prairie. Johnny's final song was in 2003, and it was entitled Engine 143, which is based off of a real story of a train wreck in West Virginia in 1890. Hurt was actually a cover song that Johnny covered from Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails, and Trent was so impressed by Johnny's cover, he deemed it Johnny's song from now on. 10 facts about John Lennon. Despite being one of the most talented musicians of all time, John could not stand his voice. He had a very bad addiction to coffee and tea and would sometimes drink north of 20 cups in one day. He dissed Paul McCartney in his infamous How Do You Sleep. He said that all Paul did while in the Beatles was write yesterday and poked fun at the conspiracy that Paul actually died in 1966. Much like a lot of musicians, John was not keen on songwriting. Despite being great at it, he had often had imposter syndrome. A good reason John and Paul got along so quickly and so early in life is both men lost both their moms before they were 18. John was a big fan of Elvis growing up, and when he met him, was not much so anymore, saying that the real Elvis Presley died a long time ago. Paul ate the brunt of the Beatles breaking up, but had always said publicly that John was the one that broke up the Beatles. Mark Chapman said the only reason he killed John was because he wanted to be famous. John once had a one-off collaboration with Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, Mitch Mitchell from the Jimi Hendrix Experience, and Eric Clapton. The reason Paul wrote Hey Jude was for Julian, John's son, to help him cope with the divorce of John and Cynthia Lennon. 10 facts about Paul McCartney. With a net worth of $1.2 billion, an endless amount of copyrights to his name, and his own royalties, Paul McCartney is the wealthiest rock and roller of all time. Yesterday, which Paul McCartney wrote, is the most covered song in the history of music. Paul's a fan of hip-hop and has collaborated twice with Kanye West and considers himself a fan of Eminem and the Wu-Tang Clan. Let It Be came about because of his mom and a dream he had about her in which she approached him, gave him some reassuring advice, and at the end of it said to just let it be. Not long after Paul would give Michael Jackson advice to become a music publisher, Michael would outbid Paul to buy the Beatles catalog. He was in a plane on the JFK tarmac in New York during 9/11, watching everything unfold in front of him. Paul owns the rights to Buddy Holly's catalog, one of his favorite artists of all time. No Beatle was invited to his 1969 wedding with Linda Eastman. Despite being one of the greatest songwriters of all time, Paul does not know how to read or write sheet music. The infamous Paul is dead conspiracy theory started when people thought he was killed in a car wreck and replaced by a look-alike. Horrible news coming out tonight. Haven't heard by now, I'm sure you will. But rest in peace to Lisa Marie Presley. Lisa, much like her wonderful mother, Priscilla, was a warrior in every sense of the word. Throughout all trials, tribulations, tragedies, deaths in the family, she persevered through all of that, and she held that Presley name in high regard. From losing her father at the age of 9 years old to losing her own son by suicide, Lisa knew plenty of what tragedy and death in the family looks and feels like, and she was able to get through all of that. The Presleys' love for Austin Butler really means a lot more now than ever, considering Lisa tried so hard and so long to try and find someone that could be her dad and accurately tell the story of Elvis Presley, and no one could do that but Austin Butler. It just means a lot more now than ever. Throughout her work, love, and contributions of trying to keep her dad's name alive, she in turn made a name for herself, and for that, much like her dad, she will never be forgotten. 10 facts about the Big Bopper. The only radio station willing to give a young Elvis Presley his exposure in music was Big Bopper's radio station in Beaumont, Texas. The Big Bopper actually served in the military, but after he was discharged from the military, he vowed to be the best disc jockey in all of East Texas. One of the first DJs to successfully transform into a successful solo musician. He actually set a then record for DJs by playing 1,821 songs consecutively, non-stop, for 5 days straight. Long before George Jones would make White Lightning the hit that it was, Big Bopper was actually the one that wrote and performed the song. Big Bopper is often credited as being the very first musician to have a music video featuring a setting, a plot, and props. His son was a professional Big Bopper impersonator. He was never supposed to be on the plane that took his life, but he asked Waylon Jennings for his spot, and he gave it to him. Chantilly Lace remains his biggest song of all time, and at one point was number 6 on the Billboard Top 100. His body was exhumed to see if he had initially survived the plane crash, which he did not. 10 facts about Eddie Cochran. When Liberty Records signed him to a deal, they thought he'd be the Elvis Presley of Liberty Records. He wrote a song entitled 3 Stars, which paid tribute to the 3 men that lost their lives in the day the music died plane crash. John Lennon was so impressed that Paul McCartney knew the chords to Eddie Cochran's song 20 Flight Rock, he would invite him to his band, which would later become the Beatles. Much like a lot of musicians around this time frame, he was a lot bigger in England than he was in the States. Eddie always feared that he would die young. He loved Hank Williams, he died young. He was close with Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens, they died young. He had just convinced himself that he was not going to be here very long. Eddie began his career alongside Hank Cochran as the Cochran brothers, even though they had no relation whatsoever. He was part of that very first class to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He often liked combining the frequencies of a bass guitar and a regular guitar to try and make a different kind of twangy sound to it. Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, the Sex Pistols, Bryan Adams, and more have covered his work. He would die in a car crash at the age of 21. 10 facts about Ritchie Valens. In 1958, he would drop out of high school and put all of his focus towards music. After Ritchie's premature death, his older brother Bob would go into harsh battles with alcoholism, drugs, and prostate cancer. Ritchie long had a fear of flying and did not like it whatsoever because of an incident that happened at his school in 1957 where 2 planes would collide in midair. Ritchie's biggest song as far as the Billboard Top 100 was Donna, a tribute song to his girlfriend. Despite the fact that he is a forefather and pioneer of Chicano rock, his career was only 8 months long. La Bamba's Origins was a Mexican wedding song that Ritchie took, added some rock, some flavor to it, and it became probably his most popular song of all time. Ritchie for a short while was in a band called the Silhouettes before he was discovered. Ritchie was totally self-taught as a musician and even taught himself how to play the guitar right-handed despite being a lefty. In his 8-month career, he would record 29 songs, 21 of which he would write. Ritchie was never supposed to be on the plane in the first place, but he had a coin flip with Tommy Allsup, and unfortunately, the rest is history. 10 facts about Bob Dylan. Dylan Thomas was a Welsh poet and was the reason that Bob changed his last name from Zimmerman to Dylan in 1962. Bob's debut album in 1962 with Columbia Records did not do well, but they had faith in him and they thought he was going to be okay, and they were right. Bob Dylan, surprisingly, walked out of an Ed Sullivan Show appearance because they could not agree on the song he was going to play. Ed Sullivan, and a musician, not seeing eye to eye, I know, I'm shocked too. In 1966, Bob actually suffered a bad motorcycle accident that kept him out of the public eye for a couple years. In 2001, he won an Oscar for his song, Things Have Changed. He tours like a madman and even started a tour back in June of '88 calling it the Never Ending Tour. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012 by President Barack Obama. He created his own whiskey entitled Heaven's Door. It took him nearly 60 years to get his first #1 hit on the Billboard Top 100. Bob is the only songwriter to ever win a Nobel Peace Prize, and he won it in 2016 for literature.